lecture in New Zealand when you were presenting the same story about
Right.
Kropotkin, then you mentioned that he noticed that the further the village was from the government,
Right.
From the institutions of the government and control of the government and things like that, that there is more this mutual aid
Yes.
thing. So I wanted to ask you, is there any confirmation in some modern social studies to this point? I would say that it would make happy most of the libertarian today.
I don't know the answer to that question. It's just a little bit too far away from by the literature that I am typically reading to know. I bet you there are people that do know. I can kind of search around and see what I can find. I mean, Kropotkin is really big in evolutionary biology these days, in geology, and geology and geography, but I don't know that whether or not the people who do the kind of studies you are talking about would know about him. But maybe they don't even need to. It doesn't matter if they knew about him or not. I just don't know if the data exists or not. I can see if I can. I know some people who might know. So drop me an email and I will contact them.
One question. You said that he was dissatisfied with this. He couldn't find a plausible explanation for why there is mutual aid in the nature, and he resorted to this Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. But this was obviously, I mean, not a really deep explanation. This is approximate explanation. Did he ever offer any deep or ultimate explanation?
Oh, right.
I don't know, individual or group selection?
That's right. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Right. So, I mean, I try to stay away from some of the more technical arguments that we might get into if this was, like an evolutionary biology department. But to answer your question, right, the Adam Smith explanation was, he specifically framed it as a proximate problem. From an evolutionary perspective, Kropotkin was one of the first and most adamant group selectionists that you can imagine. He basically thought that groups that had more cooperators, groups that had more mutual aid, would simply do better than groups that had less mutual aid. Now, when it came to humans, he was a little disappointed because, for example, when he looked at the medieval cities, he did think that the medieval cities that had lots of mutual aid were better suited to get resources and take advantage of things in the environment than where cities had less mutual aid. The problem was that often what happened was when they got big enough as a result of that, they ended up picking up weapons and trying to take over the smaller cities. Now that's also sort of a classic problem with any group selectionist kind of approach, but it really bothered Kropotkin when it came to humans. But generally, from an evolutionary perspective, he would be what we would call a group selectionist. So for everybody else in the audience, group selection is the argument that mutual aid can be favored, even if it's costly for you to help others. If that translates into your group being able to do better than other groups at getting resources, at maybe founding new cities, new populations, then mutual aid can evolve, even if it's costly to the individual. So if your group is able to get lots of resources because of mutual aid, maybe they're able to send out more colonizers and form a new group. Maybe they're better able to protect themselves against other groups. For Kropotkin, that was the evolutionary explanation for why mutual aid was prevalent. Yes?
I would like to make a comment on the first question. And I think that part of the answer why groups that are far away from the central government have more cooperation is, I don't know if you thought of it, but it has to do a lot with your last night's lecture. I think it's the kinship system. Basically, if you don't have any other form of social organization, if you don't have a central government, usually you have strong kinship systems.
Right.
You have lineages, clans, tribes,
Right.
and they're based on discipline. Basically, your rights and obligations come from this sense of hierarchy, organization, discipline, and so on. And these organizational groups are headed by sub-chiefs, chiefs, executive chiefs, etc.
Right.
So you do have this form of firm organization among the kin that might explain this mutual cooperation.
Yes.
So that comes to the ideas of
Yeah.
kinship that you mentioned yesterday as a powerful force.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So, and it would be interesting to find out if that, if you could imagine ways that you could test that hypothesis. So the thing is, from Kropotkin's perspective, he tended to think that kinship was not very important. He tended to think that people were inherently cooperative and altruistic, that it didn't have anything to do per se with kinship. But that doesn't change your argument that in fact it may be that the further you are away from the seat of government, the more likely you are to have a kinship-based system, and that tends to facilitate cooperation. That's what I was lecturing about last night. So I guess that what you'd want to do is you'd want to know whether or not that was the case, for example. I mean, I think you're probably right, but you'd want to know what the data says. And then you'd want to, presumably that's not always the case. Presumably there are some instances where you have individuals who are living away from the seat of power where it's not a kinship-based group. Even if that's the most common, there's got to be plenty of instances where it isn't true. And then you could see whether or not the correlation falls apart when it isn't true, right? Whether or not you only see that relationship when the groups are kin groups, when they're far away from government, but you don't see it when they're not kin groups and far away from government. So I have no idea what the data say, but it's an interesting hypothesis.
Might be important. I have another question for you. If you consider altruism as a more of a social phenomenon, let's say, not only as a biological, could you consider cultural evolution as a reason why it might be spreading faster?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And in fact, most of the cultural evolution models are very Lamarck-like. I mean, that's the way they're built. Yeah. So and there's also lots of cultural group selection models. And so yes, no question about it. If altruism is something that's primarily spreading through sort of teaching and social learning and all of that, you could build a cultural evolution model, and those cultural evolution models really are quite Lamarckian for the most part. So yes, no question about it.
But Lamarck was not entirely wrong. I mean, we can see some Lamarckian evolution in the bacterial population. There are some ways with
I know the work you're talking about. I would be hard pressed to come up with a single example that stood the test of time in the classic. I'm not talking about cultural stuff. I'm talking about the classic genetic. Unless you really expand what Lamarckian inheritance is to epigenetics, then you're okay.
Not in a way of.
Not in the disuse, right?
No, stretching necks or things, but they can sort of predict the next mutation.
If you're talking about the lac operon stuff, I don't think it's very, okay.
No, I agree this is far-fetched, okay. But this is usually considered in modern biology some sort of Lamarckian evolution of bacterial population.
I think the 50 responses in Nature that said what was wrong with that paper might disagree with you, but okay. We can argue about that.
In this context, Lamarck is out, definitely.
But in principle, when he came up with the idea, it was a brilliant idea. It was the first serious theory for how evolutionary change could occur. You can't, we can't be we can't look back and sort of judge him by modern standards. At the time, it was really a quite, and in fact, Darwin was a Lamarckian supporter for a very long time, even till his later years, he thought that it was a real possibility. So I didn't mean to. I'm not trying to disrespect Lamarck. I'm just. It turns out he was wrong, but lots of great ideas, turn out to be wrong. It doesn't mean that they weren't really brilliant when people came up with them. Let me just make sure I could keep. Yeah. No, because you.
All right. You did mention, and I'm not familiar with Kropotkin's work, but he obviously talks about cooperation and aid, and he did a lecture on religion.
Right.
And an anarchist, I presume he didn't think anything well, but what were his thoughts, and did he, combine the two, and did he think that had any influence? Because now we know that when you study evolution of cooperation, rituals and religion really are a significant part of that cultural transmission.
Right. So I mean, it would be hard to sort of jump ahead and say what he might think about the modern work. But if you think about, if you look at what he did say, he was a hardcore atheist, and like I said, when he lectured on Christianity and morality in the church, he insisted upon doing it in the secular part of the church, and he thought that Christianity and morality were unconnected. He tended to think of religion as the equivalent of a state-enforced set of rules, and that meant that he thought that it was a bad idea, and I think there especially he sort of saw the threat of what happens when group selection is in play, which is that individuals tend to be very, very nice and very altruistic to individuals in their group, and very, very nasty to individuals outside their group. And that whole approach to him was, was very dangerous.
Okay. So, first of all, I want to thank you for a really great lecture.
Thank you.
I want to correct one really big factual error that has more to do with Kropotkin's politics than his biology, and that's on two occasions you said that he was like really anti-communism, which couldn't be further from the truth.
I said what?
That he was anti-communist.
Oh.
Which couldn't be further from the truth because his strain of anarchism is actually called anarchist communism. So he was actually against this like authoritarian Marxist.
I was okay. Yes. So if you're a connoisseur of communism and Marxism, you're absolutely right. I was using those synonymously, and so he was absolutely positively.
That communism was really the only ethical economic system, and he wrote
That's right. So he certainly was all for the economic part of it. He just didn't want sort of the strong central government that
actually thought that communism and state were incompatible. That state necessarily leads to
right. So yes, I agree with you 100%. I was being too general in my language there.
Okay, and I also just wanted to contribute to the answer to the first question. If you're really interested in Kropotkin's ideas in practice and how anarchist communism would look in practice, you should really look into Spanish Revolution.
Okay.
It was during the Spanish Civil War there was really massive experimentation with anarchist ideas because Catalonia and Aragon at that point were actually you could say anarchist enclaves, and you had experiments with mutual aid.
Okay.
On a massive scale, millions of people involved in it, and it's really interesting results until it was smashed by fascists.
Excellent. I will. I did not realize that.
There's one thing that I think we really need to touch on. When we generally think about goodness, about mutual aid and things like that, And then you see, okay, you can find empathy clearly from your experiments from yesterday, which was wonderful, wonderful experiment, rats, this contraption. Obviously, you could see a very nice example of empathy. This is obvious. But I mean, that could be explained by their instinctively. Because if you make a mirror to the human world, you could find empathy is there obvious, more than obvious. But there is one thing that I cannot imagine happening in animal world. So, we humans, we are able to do empathy when somebody is doing harm to you. You know, turn the other cheek. But can you find at least one example from the animal world where the animal is doing good to the fellow animal that's doing bad to him? So, because the example from humanity coming with this kind of empathy could be clearly related to our free will. So you're doing it because of your free will. Obviously, it's not your pure instinct. Of course, you can drag it out of your biological instincts. Of course, you feel, you could hear the distress call, you could hear somebody's having some kind of trouble. You're trying to help you. Obviously, this is very obvious. Animals obviously can do that.
Yeah,
but if somebody is trying to kill you and you still could be good to him, and I don't see how animal can do that. So I think that, just this one sentence. So in this sense, I see fundamentally different origins, whatever you call it.
Okay, well, I would, off the top of my head, I can't think of any example like that in non-humans, and I don't actually think that I would expect to find any of that. I didn't mean to imply that we were just that animals were just sort of primitive humans, and that but at the same time, I do think there are lessons that we can learn about general patterns in social behavior by studying non-humans. When you say this is a fundamental difference between animals, non-humans, and humans, okay, if your fundamental interest is free will, it certainly is. But if you're interested sort of in just social behavior in general, I think you can make all sorts of continuum arguments. I don't know anybody who's actually. Maybe there are people. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, but I don't know anybody who's actually made the claim that animals do have free will, in the sense of. So if you want to understand free will, then you wouldn't be looking for free will in animals. That wouldn't be the only thing you might look for. I guess what I would want to do is sort of sit down and think, okay, I don't know of any examples like that in animals, but what else would I expect an organism to do if they had free will besides that? And then ask the question, okay, do I see any of that? Even in a really simple form in non-humans? And maybe the answer is no. Maybe there's actually no way to sort of connect us. Maybe that is simply a uniquely human thing that comes around when various layers of the brain are put on. The only reason I would be skeptical, okay, and really want to think it through, is that historically, every time someone makes an argument like that about what's fundamentally different in humans and non-humans, it turns out to be wrong. Okay, but now maybe that one, maybe yours is not. But this is sort of like, this happens all the time, right? Tool use and various other things, and it turns out, it's a continuum. But I'd be hard pressed off the top of my head to think about what that would be. So, but it would be fun to sort of sit down and say, what else would I expect? And do I see anything?
The general idea was this could help us in preparing better experiments.
Sure, absolutely. That's always a good idea.
Just to comment on this, nobody showed that gave a good example of free will in animals, but then again, nobody proved that. But inequality, the concept of free will exists in humans also. We have a lacking model of behavior. If we could compute all the variables, I think the concept of free will would fundamentally disappear.
I agree with you, but at the same time, that doesn't, you could turn, that might be the case, and it might also be the case that, let's just throw away free will at that term and say, okay, do we find any instances where animals do that thing that do we find any instances where someone is being aggressive and really nasty and you turn around and do something nice, aside from the issue of free will? I can't think of any, but I agree with you. We don't, free will is a hard thing to document in humans, let alone in non-humans.
But I mean,
I don't think
if you look at the optimal cooperation.
No, I don't think this is the point, breaking point for science. This is where science is.
But look at
epistemologically reductionism. I don't think we can.
No, but look at Axelrod's experiments on cooperation, and if you see the
proposition that here's another question. I just want to say, if you pressure a human enough, he will also will not turn the other cheek in the end. He will do instantly and save his life in the end.
Well,
that's an empirical question. I think we'd have to find out if that's true. I mean, there are probably examples where it isn't, but I would imagine they're rare, where someone would never turn around and respond aggressively. I mean, but there probably are some. I don't know if there are enough to make it interesting, but there are some.